My topic is euthanasia, and my proposition on euthanasia is that it is the most effective option for those who are terminally ill or have a disorder of consciousness, which can be patients who are in a vegetative state or in coma. My three secondary claims that support this proposition are euthanasia ends patient suffering, opting out on euthanasia when necessary is a waste of resources, and finally, euthanasia is not equivalent to murder. Let me begin by defining euthanasia. Euthanasia is derived from the Greek terms eu meaning good and thanatos meaning death, and can be defined as a painless means of ending a patient's life if terminally ill or if he or she has some type of disorder of consciousness. The controversy within the argument of euthanasia is that for those who support it, it ends patients' unnecessary suffering. If they don't need to suffer, then why put them through it? And for those against it, they argue that it is unjust to take someone else's life, and that life is divine and could potentially lead to people murdering patients and disguising it as euthanasia if not properly supervised by trained professionals or doctors or physicians. My first supporting claim is that euthanasia ends patient suffering. Why should terminally ill patients or those without any consciousness suffer for any longer? In 1993, Sue Rodriguez, a 42-year-old woman from Canada, was diagnosed with Lou Gehrig's disease, or amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, which is a neurodegenerative disease that causes muscles to slowly deteriorate, potentially leading to the patient choking to death. Sue pleaded with the Supreme Court of Canada to allow a trained physician to help her with assisted suicide when she felt the time was right for her to die. She was denied that right by the court in a 5-4 decision, but was later helped by an anonymous physician who in February 1994 assisted her in suicide, breaking the law, which was punishable by a maximum of 14 years in prison. Although the Canadian Supreme Court did not allow Sue the right to assisted suicide, she still went through with it because otherwise she would have died a slow and painful death. Patients who are in comas or in a vegetative state can no longer live on their own and require a machine or physician to help keep him or her alive. These types of patients will never be the people they once were. Most will never have any signs of consciousness or awareness, and therefore will have no will to live. In 1990, a woman named Terry Schindler-Schiavo suffered a cardiorespiratory arrest and was later diagnosed with hypoxia encephalopathy, a neurological injury caused by lack of oxygen to the brain, which led to a coma. Terry was then placed on a ventilator and was provided a PEG tube to her stomach due to her incapability to eat on her own. This later turned into a serious case between Terry's parents, Robert and Mary Schindler, and her husband, Michael Schiavo, who felt otherwise. After many years of determining what was the right thing to do, Terry was eventually taken off of life support on March 25, 2005, and died 13 days later. This case created much attention and sparked thought on the topic of euthanasia and whether or not it is just. My second supporting claim is that opting out on euthanasia when necessary, that is, if the patient is terminally ill or has a disorder of consciousness, is a waste of resources, whether monetary, medical, or nutritional, etc. Euthanasia is an option that allows such a way to end patient suffering while saving medical and nutritional resources. As a result, these patients can be given a peaceful death, and the resources that would have been used to keep them alive can now be used towards the rehabilitation of another patient in need. And with their permission, the organs of these patients could possibly be used towards those who may be in need of a liver, a heart, or a kidney, etc. It can save another person's life, and ultimately, the suffering patient gets a peaceful ending. In the Terry Schiavo case, lasting from 1990 to 2005, Terry Schiavo's husband, Michael Schiavo, had claimed in 1992 that Terry had told him prior to the accident that she did not want to be kept alive artificially, and he only wanted what was best for his wife. Had not his wife said this, Michael Schiavo would have been willing to pay for her future medical bills. Estimating her life expectancy was 50 years or so, her medical expenses could have easily cost Michael Schiavo millions of dollars. Millions of dollars wasted to keep Terry still alive but not conscious, which she mentioned was not how she wanted to live. My final supporting claim is that euthanasia is not equivalent to murder. Death is a private matter and doesn't inflict any harm to others. Therefore, no one has the right to interfere. When terminally ill patients request assisted suicide because they cannot do it on their own, the patient is giving the physician consent. Therefore, the physician assisting in the suicide is by no means at fault because he or she has no control over the patient's decision. To summarize, I discussed my three supporting claims: euthanasia ends patient suffering, opting out on euthanasia when necessary is a waste of resources, and finally, euthanasia is not equivalent to murder, supporting my proposition that euthanasia is the most effective option for those who are terminally ill or have a disorder of consciousness. Thank you.
Jonathan, you've done a little bit of the same sort of thing as we've heard in a couple of other speeches. You do have the proposition. It is clearly stated as a factual issue, but then it's got dependent clauses built into it that I think are a little bit problematic. Definitional and qualifying issues should be separated to some degree. You do lay out the contents of the speech pretty effectively. There's plenty of controversy on the subject matter. I think, however, that a couple of the points sound like they are value issues rather than issues of fact. The first point is the clearest issue that is factual in nature, and that is the claim that euthanasia ends pain or suffering. I think you need to establish a little bit more effectively that there is suffering as a result of people in these particular situations. The one example you have is the woman in Canada who had ALS, who claims that, that she wanted to be able to end before she went through any particular suffering. I don't know that there isn't any other way to relieve her suffering. If there isn't treatment, palliative care, some kind of hospice care that would minimize that suffering, and why the one is superior to the other, or if we can relieve the suffering without having to end somebody's life, why that is a better choice, why that is a safer choice. Except that the argument that you make on the second point, which is about resources, and we'll get to that one in just a second. The argument about the consistent vegetative state, it crosses a line on most of the arguments that people deal with on this issue. If we have debates on this later on, people frequently use physician-assisted suicide. Of course, this is not in that category because this is not a decision that was being made by the person who was suffering in this situation. This was a decision being made by somebody on that person's behalf. And it appears that there was a dispute between the parents and the husband as to whether or not this was the appropriate thing to do, whether or not this was right. And that's an example of a value conflict. Whose rights should take precedence in that situation? That's not an issue of fact, that's an issue of value. Now, the issue of resources, I think there is once again, there's that presupposition of suffering. I think that you need to develop that argument a lot more. The issue of resources is largely unquantifiable, except that you've got this hypothetical about what Terry Schiavo's situation would be. We got a lot of those kinds of criteria. I'm not exactly sure what the criteria is that we should use in determining when a life has no value anymore, but I do know that that's a value argument. All right, so Terry Schiavo or other people in those similar situations, persistent vegetative states, there may be some question about what's going on there and whether or not we ought to do that. But like I said, I think that's a value issue. If somebody is born with such severe birth defects that they are functionally nothing more than a pile of gibbering goo, does that mean that we should be able to euthanize them? That's a value question. It's not an issue of fact. The issue, there's not a dispute of fact that there's a lot of money that's spent on that. The question is that money wasted? And the waste issue is a value issue once again. All right, so at the end, you say, well, it's you come back to the issue of murder, and you say it's not murder. Nobody, it doesn't affect anybody else. But apparently, the Canadian Supreme Court disagrees with you, and you need to give us a reason why we should believe you instead of the Canadian Supreme Court in this particular context. And so, if you're going to make a value claim, you ought to have some criteria for the value argument and explain why the other criteria is not a legitimate one. Your evidence mostly consists of the examples that you have and the court ruling. And those are, I think, a good start. But on the first point, I think you need a lot more information about what the suffering consists of and that there isn't any alternative on that. And on the other points, like I said, you need to get out of the value-based issues and talk about what the consequences are from an objective standard. I thought you did a pretty good job delivering the speech, even though I think you're reading a lot more than you want to do. But you did try to talk to the audience, and you made pretty regular audience contact too. Thank you.